Hello and welcome to our webinar, The New FLSA Salary Test, What You Need to Know Right Now. My name's Laura and I'm in compliance at Backtrack. We're pleased to have John Hyman back with us presenting the webinar again today. John's a partner at Meyers Roman and practices in the area of labor and employment and human resources. He's also a noted blogger, author, and speaker. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. The live webinar is eligible for one general recertification credit through the HRCI. Please complete the survey at the end of the webinar and we'll email the certificate to you later this week. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all who have registered for it. It'll also be available on our Backtrack website. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the control panel and they will be answered at the end of the webinar. So now, I'll turn this over to you, John.
Great, thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back speaking again for Backtrack. This is now, I think, I want to say our 7th webinar in this series, but the number could be off by one. But it's always great to be asked and to come present for my friends over at Backtrack, and thank you to them for having me back to talk to you guys again today with a topic that is extraordinarily current, and that is the new and soon to be effective salary test under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I'm sure you have all now heard about it. The new salary level for the Fair Labor Standards Act for the white collar exemptions. We'll talk in a second about what that number is, but really what we're talking about, what we're going to talk about for the next hour is a dollar figure. We're going to talk about a number, what the salary was and what it has been increased to for certain white-collar exemptions under the FLSA for beginning December 1, 2016. And, it's on the one hand hard to think, as I was thinking about my remarks today, how do you fill an hour to talk about a number, right? I mean, the news is what it is. The number's been increased from one number to another number, and that's, on the one hand, that's all there is. But on the other hand, this issue has some pretty significant implications for employers in terms of who is defined as exempt and who is not defined as exempt, what you do with those folks that you currently have defined as exempt but are going to maybe have to switch to non-exempt, the HR or employee relations issues that go along with that, how you communicate that to your employees, what it means to them as employees, those that are not used to punching a clock but are going to have to start punching the clock if they all of a sudden on November 30 they're exempt and December 1 they're non-exempt. There's a whole, and then there's nuances in the regulations as well. So there's a whole bunch of issues to talk through, and my goal over the next hour is to get through all of them and give you a good kind of base of knowledge and action plan moving forward within your organizations on how to prepare for, proactively prepare for this change, so you're not kind of on your heels reacting with your folks come December 1. Before we know kind of where we're going, we need to know where we are now or where we've been, and this is what the current exemption test under the Fair Labor Standards Act looks like. And again, when we talk about exempt under the FLSA, under the Federal Wage and Hour Laws, we're talking about it has one clear meaning. Exempt means you don't have to be paid overtime. Non-exempt means you do have to be paid overtime. Period. That's what the difference is between exempt and non-exempt. If you don't have to get paid overtime, if you're not overtime eligible, you're a non-exempt employee, or rather, you're exempt employee. Work as many hours in a week as you want. Your salary, or for a computer professional exemption, your hourly rate covers those hours. If you are non-exempt, overtime eligible, if you work more than 40 hours in a week, you have to be paid time and a half your regular rate of pay for those hours over 40. Very significant in determining who is and isn't exempt, and this is what the test looks like. It's really a two-step process. 2 is broken down into 2 different parts. So step 1 is how is the person paid? Are they paid on a salary basis? Currently, $455 per week or $23,660 annually, with the one exception of a computer professional, which is a salary of $455 per week or an hourly rate of $27.63 per hour for someone who qualifies under the computer professional exemption. That's the salary test. And then if you pass that salary test, if an employee passes that salary test, you move on to the what we refer to as the duties test, which is steps 2 and 3 on the flow chart in front of you, which is does the employee perform one of these jobs: executive, administrative, professional, creative, computer professional, outside sales? And if they do fall into one of those broad categories, you need to do kind of a deep analysis of their job duties to determine if they qualify under the if they qualify for a specific exemption. I'm not going to spend too much time on the duties test because the duties test hasn't changed with these new regulations. The only thing that has changed is the salary test. Step 1, the $455 per week or $23,660 annually has effective December 1 changed to $47,476 per year or $913 per week salary for an employee to qualify under the Fair Labor Standards Act, one of these various white-collar exemptions. And by way of illustration for how dramatic of a jump this is, right? So we can see that it's more than doubled, right? It went from $455 to $913 per week. That is, $3 north of a double. $3 north of a, I'm doing the math right in my head. $3 north of a doubling of the salary basis test per week. But you can contrast that to the fact that it was $455 for a while, and I think just about everybody would agree that $455 per week or $23,660 a year, a number that in many areas falls below the poverty line, was probably artificially low for someone to be, have a salary high enough to qualify them as an exempt worker. So we see the number has doubled to $913 a week, $47,476 a year. And again, by way of comparison, just to see how dramatic of an increase that is, compare the new federal salary test for exempt workers to the same exact test in California. If you think of kind of the weirdest employment law place you can think of, I mean, that's California. It's the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of employment laws. If you can't fire anybody for anything, paid time off for workers. Overtime is not just on a weekly basis, but on a daily basis. Specific rules as to when employees can and can't take breaks. Mandatory carryover of unused vacation time for employees from year to year. California is the kind of holy grail of protections for employees, and yet in the Willy Wonka employment law world of California, the salary test for someone to be a salaried exempt employee under California's wage and hour law is only $41,600 a year. So it's roughly $6,000 less than what the feds jumped the rule to under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so I think we can all agree that even though $455 per week was artificially low, if $913 a week is, give or take 15% higher than what California even does, I think everybody, no matter how left you may lean, would probably agree that the 913 is likely too high. But regardless, right, that's the number we're stuck with, and we're stuck with it for the next 3 years. The Department of Labor, in its wisdom, it will tell you, because the number had been unchanged for so long and allowed to fall so out of whack with what people actually make, right? Well, if it's below if 455 is below the poverty line in many places, we can see how that number kind of fell out of line with what we think of as an exempt employee should be making on the job. In a salary, the Department of Labor says we're going to relook at this number and re-index this number every 3 years. And they're going to re-index it, recalculate it the same way they calculated it this time, which is the Department of Labor said we're going to look at the lowest wage earning geographical area in the census, which for the last census was the southeastern United States. So that's people on average make less in the southeastern U.S. than anywhere else in the country. So says the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We're going to then look at the 40th percentile of what the average worker earns in that lowest wage earning part of the country, and that 40% in that lowest earning geographical region, that's our salary test. $913 a week, $47,476 per year, 40th percentile, lowest wage earning geographical part of the country. And they're going to go through this exercise every 3 years. So if we make less on average in the country, if everyone's wages go down, this number will go down. In all likelihood, it will likely in 3 years go up, but clearly not as dramatically as it did with the 100 and some odd % raise we experienced this time. The Department of Labor estimates this is going to add 4.2 million more workers to the rolls of those who are eligible for overtime nationally. 4.2 million more workers are now going to be overtime eligible according to the Department of Labor. And when you look at it kind of state by state, this is what the DOL says. Each state will be impacted in terms of their workforce for who's going to become overtime eligible. And you can see Ohio, not on the higher end really. Not surprisingly, the most impacted people are going to be, again, in that poorest part of the country, the southeast, the darker shades on the map. Ohio, say about 2.9% of the workforce in Ohio generally is going to shift as a result of this increase from exempt to non-exempt and have to be paid overtime. This is what if you recall, the flow chart we looked at a few moments ago. This is what the white-collar exemptions are going to look like beginning December 1, 2016. Again, it's really a two-pronged test, the salary level test and the duties test, and these are the 4 and only 4 exemptions that the new salary test is going to impact. The executive exemption, the administrative exemption, the profession, and the computer professional exemption. And across the board, we see $913 a week as the baseline for the salary test under one of these exemptions, with a couple of exceptions. For the professional or creative professional exemption, the salary test does not apply to doctors, lawyers, or teachers. So if you're a doctor or lawyer or a teacher, no matter what you make, you are exempt, period. And for computer professionals, it's an either-or, $913 a week or $27.63 per hour. If you earn either or both of those, then you are also exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Provided then you meet the duties test, and again, I don't want to beat on these too much because these have remained unchanged, and they likely will remain unchanged for the foreseeable future. I think if the White House goes a certain way in November, you may see some action on some sharpening of these duties tests to bring even more employees under the umbrella of non-exempt, make more folks overtime eligible. But these are the tests we have for now. So we have an executive employee, and again, these are, you look at someone's primary duty, and I'm watering these down and oversimplifying them, but this is kind of the core factor for each of the tests. So an executive employee, is you're looking at someone who really, manages the enterprise or manages a recognized department or subdivision of the enterprise and manages at least 2 full-time employees within that enterprise or subdivision of the enterprise. So really, you're looking for someone who's, kind of the the guy on top, really someone who is in charge, right? Executive person, exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act if they're making $9.13 a week. Administrative exemption, this is the one that employers get wrong the most because the term administrative is misleading. People think that anybody who serves an administrative function, right, works with paper, is exempt under or qualifies for an exemption under the administrative exemption. Not the case. It is not someone who serves an administrative function, but rather someone who exercises discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance in their job. Right? If they have the ability with matters of significance to kind of decide how things are done without having to answer to anybody else or without having anyone else managing or second guessing or having to approve the decisions they make, exempt administrative professional provided they're making, or exempt administrative employee provided they're making $9.13 a week. Professional exemption, work that either requires advanced knowledge in the field of science or learning, or that requires some kind of invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. So, a bona fide, someone who is genuinely using their talent to create something original, a creative professional, or someone who has a degree, advanced knowledge in a field of science or learning, professional exemption, and again, $9.13 a week, except for doctors, lawyers, or teachers. And then computer professionals, you're looking at not just someone who works with computers. Again, this one is also screwed up, I think, by employers more often than it's gotten correct. It's not just someone who works on a computer, but it's someone who is, writing code, software engineers, programmers, designing computer systems. So it's not necessarily your IT professional who's sitting in a help desk and troubleshooting, but it's someone who is designing the computer system, deploying the computer system, writing code, etc. Your bona fide exempt computer professionals, again, $9.13 a week, or for the case of this exemption, $27.63 per hour. There are other exemptions in the Fair Labor Standards Act. These are not impacted by the new salary test. There's an exemption for outside sales, commissioned outside sales employees. There's an exemption for commissioned retail sales. Somebody who works in a store but works at least earns part of their wages on commission. There's an exemption for motor carriers. There's other exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act, none of which are impacted by the new salary test. The only exemptions that are going to be impacted by the new salary test are executive, administrative, professional, or computer professional. That's it. The new salary test under the Fair Labor Standards Act has an additional unique component that did not exist before in calculating one's salary, and that is what I and others refer to as the 10% rule. The 10% rule allows employers to include non-discretionary bonuses and incentive payments, including commissions, to satisfy up to 10% of the salary threshold for the exemption, which means that if somebody is, let's say you have an employee who's making $45,000 a year salary, and you have a bonus plan that's going to bonus them $20,000, $25,000 at the end of the year. Non-discretionary, they hit a certain metric. Again, we're talking about non-discretionary bonuses and incentive comp. And commission here can't be something you decide to do. It has to be a number that comes from a defined plan, some document, something that you don't have any discretion. You have to pay it if a certain target, a certain number is hit, or whatever the metric is. employee makes $45,000 a year. There's a non-discretionary bonus of $25,000 they get at year's end. You're allowed to count up to 10% of that non-discretionary comp towards their salary. So that $45,000 a year employee is going to make $70,000 is what's going to show up on their W-2 as their as their annual compensation, 45 plus 25. But for purposes of the exemption, you're allowed to take 10% of that $25,000 or $2,500, add it to the $45,000 to give you $47,500, which, surprise, surprise, for purposes of my very convenient illustration, is higher than $47,476, which means that that employee is hits the salary test, and provided they also meet the duties test, is going to be an exempt employee to whom you do not have to pay overtime. Again, these are non-discretionary payments. They have to include meeting production goals, retention bonuses, commission payments based on a fixed formula, etc. If you have the discretion of whether to make the award to the employee, the payment to the employee, you cannot count it towards an employee salary test. Okay, that's point number one with these non-discretionary bonuses and incentive payments. Rule number two is, even though the example I gave you was on an annual basis, you actually cannot use annual payments for these non-discretionary payments to count towards the salary test. You have to pay it either quarterly or more frequently than quarterly in order to count a non-discretionary bonus or incentive payment towards an employee's salary for purposes of qualifying for the FLSA's salary test. If you pay it weekly, great, because that's easy to figure out how that impacts the $913 a week salary. Let me make the point now, if I haven't made it clearly before, that while we talk about this in terms of $47,476 annual salary, the salary test is a weekly test. It is $913 a week that an employee must earn, no matter what their annual salary is. It's $913 a week in order to qualify for one of the exemptions, one of these white-collar exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act. These non-discretionary bonus incentive comp payments, quarterly or more frequently. If you pay it on the least frequent schedule you're allowed under the rules, which is quarterly, you then prorate it on a weekly basis throughout that quarter in order to see how that 10% impacts an employee's salary on a week-to-week basis to figure out whether or not that employee qualifies under the for the exemption under the salary test. Another nuance to the salary exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act is there is actually a separate exemption for what the Fair Labor Standards Act calls highly compensated employees. Currently, the dollar amount for someone to qualify as a highly compensated employee is $100,000 annually. This is an annual test, not a weekly test. Unlike the $913 a week traditional salary test, this is an annualized $100,000 salary. That is also increasing. It's going from $100,000 to $134,004 annually. And so, beginning December 1, if you're paying an employee $134,004 annually, they will potentially qualify as a highly compensated employee exempt from overtime, provided that they otherwise meet the highly compensated employees minimal duties test. And so what the Fair Labor Standards Act says is, if you're making that amount of money, they're essentially going to, presume's not the right word, but they're going to give an employer the benefit of the doubt. If you're paying someone $134,004 a year, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt that that person probably is going to meet the duties test under the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's one of their exemptions. So all the FLSA requires you to do is just perform one of the exempt duties or responsibilities. Doesn't have to be primary, as long as you're performing one of the otherwise exempt qualifying duties under any of the FLSA's tests. For an exempt executive, administrative, or professional employee, you get the benefit of being an exempt, highly compensated employee. The only caveat being that while the $134,004 is an annualized number, an employee still must be paid a weekly salary of a minimum of $913 a week, beginning December 1, $455 currently, in order to get the benefit of the exemption. So it is $913 a week salary, and then if you hit that target threshold of $134 and $4 annually, you get the benefit of treating that employee as a highly compensated employee, provided they meet the very, very reduced minimal duties test, watered down duties test under the highly compensated employee exemption. The Department of Labor estimates this is going to only impact about 35,000 employees, this change, 4.2 million globally, but this particular change to the regulations only impact about 35,000 employees. I think it's less than that. I mean, if you are paying someone even $100,000 a year, let alone $134,004 per year, I would bet dollars to donuts they're already getting a weekly salary of $455 or $913 a week, and they're going to be doing enough of significance to qualify them already as an exempt employee. But if they're not, this test is there available for you if you have employees that are making that high of a salary. Okay, so that's the test. That's the salary test, kind of the nuts and bolts. The nuts and bolts of the salary test. And so the question that I get now all the time from employers, and what I'm spending a lot of my time doing for my clients, is, all right, we understand the test. We understand $913 a week. We understand what that means come December 1. Now, John, tell us what we do about it. What do we do between now and then to prepare? And that's what you all need to really be thinking about now. There is you have the benefit of some time to prepare. There was a lot of fear and anxiety that when the Department of Labor initially proposed these rules, that we were going to have no lead time to prepare. They were going to drop this rule. No one knew what the salary threshold was going to be. The Department of Labor kept it a big secret until the regulations finally published in May. And there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing and angst that they were going to drop this rule, and it was going to be a 30-day effective date, and then employers are going to have to comply. While we can take issue with the Department of Labor that the 913 number is too high, we can't take issue with the fact that they gave employers plenty of run-up time. The rule dropped in May. It's not effective till December 1. There was a more than 6-month run-up time to kind of get your wage and hour house in order to figure out what you're going to do with your exempt employees who are currently making less than $913 a week. And you have multiple options available to you, and it's not too late. If you haven't done anything current up to today, you still have plenty of time to figure out what you're going to do. It's not even September 1 yet. You still have all of September, all of October, all of November before we get to December 1 to figure out what you're going to do with your folks. And while time is running shorter, you still have plenty of time to figure out what your solution is going to be. The first thing you need to do in preparing for this change is to figure out who this change is going to impact. If you have no non-exempt employees, if you have no exempt employees currently earning less than $913 a week, bravo, click off the webinar. You don't need to listen to me talk for the next half an hour. However, from what I've seen from companies, and I've looked at dozens of companies in the last few months that are going to be impacted by these regulation change, by the regulation change, the salary test change, every company has somebody currently classified as exempt that is making less than $913 a week. Okay, and so you have, for that person or persons, you have multiple options available to you, okay? You can keep them as a salaried worker, okay, and pay them overtime for any hours they work over 40 in a week. There's no magic to being salaried and being exempt, okay, or being non-exempt. People think there's a big misconception that just because I'm salaried, just because we pay this person a salary, they're exempt. Not true. Remember, it's a two-pronged test. You have to be paid the minimum salary level, and you have to meet the duties test, okay? You can still perform all the duties of an exempt worker, not meet the salary test. You're not exempt. You have to be paid overtime for hours you work over 40 in a week. That's done on a, you could treat a salaried person as non-exempt, pay them overtime. The only catch with that is their overtime rate is going to change from week to week based on how many hours they work in a week. If someone is salaried, non-exempt, you calculate their overtime rate based on their effective hourly rate for that week. So if someone's making $500, a $500 weekly salary, okay, they're going to be non-exempt. If they work 50 hours that week, their effective hourly rate that week is $10 an hour, which means they have an overtime premium of $15 an hour, which means for the extra 10 hours of overtime they've worked that week, you owe them $15 an hour times 10 hours, or $150. So that person, that worker with the $500 an hour, $500 a week salary, non-exempt, who works 10 hours of overtime that week, that person's take-home pay at the end of that week is actually going to be $650. The $500 in salary plus the $150 in overtime. That's option number one. You can raise your employee's salary above $913 a week. For employees that are close to $913 a week, that may be a viable option to keep them exempt. If someone's making, every organization is going to be different to determine what you think is close to $913 a week. If someone's making $900 a week, to bump them up $13 a week to get them to the level of the exemption, probably not that big a deal. $850 becomes a bigger deal, $800 a bigger deal, $700 a bigger deal, and on down the line to people who are making as little as $455. The downside of raising someone's salary above the new threshold is you're going to bump into kind of salary contraction. You're going to bump into the issue of an assistant manager making the same as a manager to whom they report or close to it, because you're going to have contraction of salaries across job functions or across seniority levels, longevity levels with your organization, because you are raising salaries to get people to qualify for exemption. Are you going to bump everyone else up who's already at $913 a week? Are you going to raise them up by proportionately to keep the same spread across your employees, or are you going to allow your salaries to contract within your organization? That's a problem for companies, and there's no solution. There's no right or wrong answer, but there has to be an answer to figure out how to handle that within your organization. You can limit workers to 40 hours a week. You can say you are now a non-exempt worker, but you're not allowed to work more than 40 hours a week, and we're going to talk. We're going to close that loop on the back end of the presentation on how exactly you do that. You can for employees that are close, you can put non-discretionary incentive and bonus plans in place. When I talk to companies, so you can get the benefit of the 10% add-on to someone's salary to get them to that level for employees that are close enough. When I talk to companies about this issue, the goal that I try to set for them in kind of analyzing this whole process is you want to keep your wage costs the same, okay? In order to do that, you need to try to get everybody's W-2 at the end of the year to look the same for 2016 as it did for 2015, as it will for 2017. What you don't want to do is have a huge increase of either higher salaries or more overtime costs that are going to push your payroll costs higher and throw your budget out of whack. Okay, But the only way you can know how this rule is going to impact you as an organization is if you start auditing now. You're going to have a whole bunch of people that are currently exempt, okay, who are not used to punching a time clock, keeping track of their time, who are beginning December 1, if they switch to non-exempt, are going to have to start tracking their time, okay? And you can't get a sense of how many hours these people work in a week, to how a switch to non-exempt is going to impact your bottom line unless you start tracking that time now, okay? You won't know what hourly rate to pay someone if you're going to switch them to an hourly position, unless you know, are they working 40 hours in a week, are they working 50 hours in a week, are they working 60 hours in a week, are they working 30 hours in a week. It all makes a difference because all of that, anything extra, any gravy over 40, has to be paid at time and a half. Same for if you keep someone on a salary, you can't figure out what to set that salary, what number to set that salary, unless you know how many hours on average somebody is working in a week, because you have to take that overtime into consideration. And yeah, there's a big risk that if you have a salaried worker who's currently exempt, who's making $40,000 a year, but works 60 hours a week, and you say, unfortunately, we've got to cut your salary to $32,000 a year because you work all this overtime, and we need you to work the overtime, and we can't limit the overtime because we need to get the job done. There's a big morale hit, a big risk you take in dropping someone's salary in order to get them to the same number at the end of the year, particularly when overtime's never guaranteed. One option I offer companies, for example, is you tell employees, we have to cut your salary to $32,000 a year, but the goal is to keep you at the same, W-2 number at year's end, and so we will bonus you at the end of the year to get you to that number if you fall short, if overtime falls shorter than expected. That may be a good solution for some of your workers. For some who rely on their paycheck week to week to make ends meet, that might not be a good solution. So like I said, there really is no kind of one-size-fits-all answer to what you do for your employees in order to figure out how you're going to handle those folks who are currently earning less than $913 a week but are right now classified as exempt. But the bottom line is you got to do something, because come December 1, anyone making less than $913 a week who is currently exempt is going to switch to non-exempt. If you do nothing, you're going to owe them all overtime if they're working more than 40 hours in a week, and you can't figure out what that overtime exposure is going to look like unless you now start tracking how many hours a week these people are actually working. Another option that is available for an employer, for employees that are salaried non-exempt, that is, that you keep them on a salary, but you don't raise their comp over $913 a week, so they're salaried non-exempt, is what's called the fluctuating work week. And if you remember my example earlier of the employee who was making $500 a week, worked 50 hours, was owed $150 in overtime, you can pretty significantly lower your overtime exposure by putting those salaried non-exempt workers on what's called a fluctuating work week. There's a pretty strict test that you have to meet, but if you meet that test, you can experience a pretty significant cost savings in how much overtime you have to pay your employees. Flexible or fluctuating work week. Number one, the employee's hours must actually fluctuate from week to week. If they work a fixed schedule, I work 50 hours every week, tune me out for the next 2 minutes, none of this is going to apply to you. But if you have a salaried non-exempt employee whose hours genuinely fluctuate, are flexible from week to week, keep listening. The employee must be paid a fixed salary that doesn't fluctuate based on the number of hours they work. You're paid a salary of $500 a week, no matter how many hours you work during that week. If you take that salary and divide it by how many hours the employee works in a week, it has to equal at least the minimum wage, which in Ohio is $8.10 an hour. So you can't pay them an effective hourly rate of less than the minimum wage, and that holds true regardless, but for this test as well. And then you have to have what the courts refer to and the regulations refer to as a clear mutual understanding that you will pay a fixed salary regardless of the number of hours the employee works. I always think it's good to get these clear mutual understandings in writing. It doesn't have to be, but you have to let the employee know that your salary, what we pay you in a salary, covers you for all hours you work in that week, your straight time rate for all hours you work in that week. And provided that the hours fluctuate from week to week, they get a fixed salary, they're being paid at least the minimum wage, and you have this clear mutual understanding that they're being paid for all their straight time hours. You can apply what the regulations refer to as a fluctuating or flexible work week, which means that you've already paid them for the straight time component of their overtime hours. So instead of having to pay them 1.5 overtime premium for the extra hours they work in a week, you only owe them the 0.5. So in my example, for the employee that's making $500 a week salary, they're working 50 hours in a week, that's $10 an hour, and they've been paid that $10 an hour across the board for all their time. And then all you owe them for that extra 10 hours is the 0.5 overtime kicker. So instead of that employee making $650 at the end of that week, they're making $550, the 0.5 extra for the extra 10 hours they work in a week. That's the fluctuating work week, and and it dovetails nicely into kind of how I want to tie this all up, which is the biggest employee relations issue that you are going to have with your employees moving forward, for those, particularly those that you're going to have to switch from exempt to non-exempt because there's just no way to get them to that $913 a week threshold, is lost flexibility, right? That's what we all enjoy about being exempt workers, is the flexibility of, I work 35 hours this week, I work 45 hours next week, we work to get the job done. We're not clock watchers, we're not time clock punchers, we don't record how many hours they work. Ideally, people aren't watching over our backs to see when we come and when we go. Ideally, I know your mileage and your workplace might vary on that, but exempt employees are used to being flexible, and they are going to lose that flexibility as a result of this change, because now all that flexibility, all that time they're not working doesn't have to be paid for, and the time they are working has to be paid, and it's the latter piece that is particularly going to be painful for employees, or for employers rather, things like off-the-clock work. Okay, your salaried exempt folks are used to sitting on their couch at night with their smartphones, answering emails, responding to text messages and what have you. That flexibility is going to be gone now, because if an employee is giving you, the employer, a benefit by answering emails when they're quote-unquote off the clock, reading and responding to emails, that's compensable time that has to be paid. And if they're an hourly, or if they're a non-exempt employee, whether hourly or salaried, that goes into the calculus of how many hours they worked in the week for which they must be paid. Meal periods and rest periods. Unless I have a meeting with a client, or a record, or a deposition, I oftentimes eat at my desk because it gets me quicker. It gets me home to my kids sooner. If your employees are, if your non-exempt employees are working through their lunch, guess what? They have to be paid for it. If they are doing anything during their lunch period that benefits you, it is paid compensable time. And unless they are totally relieved of their work duties during their lunch periods, during their meal periods, it has to be paid. It's compensable time. The same with rest breaks. Rest breaks, which the law defines as any break less than 20 minutes long, has to be paid. And for a salaried worker who's getting a salary no matter how many hours they work, exempt, not paid overtime, not that big a deal. For your non-exempt workers, if someone's, every 10 minutes going to grab a smoke, guess what? That's working time. That's compensable time. Huge kind of paradigm shifting thought change for your workers who are all of a sudden going to turn into clock punchers. Pre and post liminary time you spend before your workday starts and after your workdays end, doing things related to work. It might be putting on safety gear if you work in a manufacturing facility. I work behind a desk. I sit behind a computer. How about the time when I get into my office and turn my computer on and log in, the 2 or 3 minutes it takes for my computer to boot up? Guess what? That might be compensable time that an employee has to be paid for. The same with shutting down the computer at the end of the day. And if you are a non-exempt white-collar worker who works at a computer, that is compensable time that has to be paid. And if that puts someone over 40 in a week, it has to be paid at the 1.5 overtime premium. Commuting and travel time. This is the one I think that is going to give employers the most headaches, because there's really huge blocks of time here when employees spend traveling, and for, let's say you have a salesperson that is making $600 a week. That person is now non-exempt. It has to be paid overtime if they're working more than 40 hours in a week. But what part of their travel counts as compensable? If they're leaving, from their home and going to a customer or a client or a sales location, that's not compensable time. They're traveling to the place of work. If they're going on overnight travel, the law says that only overnight travel that takes place during someone's normal hours of work counts as compensable. And so if you have an employee who's now non-exempt that you send on the road, it's maybe going to a conference out of town, and they have to take a flight at 9 o'clock at night, and they don't get to their hotel until 12:30 in the morning, none of that time is compensable. They don't get paid. None of it counts as working time. They don't get paid for any of it. But I guarantee you, they're not going to like that. There are huge implications for how employees are paid for time they spend traveling, and it's going to hit these kind of non-exempt white-collar workers the hardest, which is why, because of the impact of this, the best thing you can do, aside from auditing your workforces to figure out who is impacted and how they're going to be impacted and what you're going to do about the impact, is figuring out how you're going to communicate these changes to your workers. Like I said, you have 90 days, 90-plus days to get your kind of wage hour exemption house in order for these white-collar workers. Take the time also to develop an appropriate communication plan for how you're going to communicate these changes to your workers. What are you going to tell them? Who are you going to charge with communicating any changes to your workers? Is senior management going to do it? Is HR going to do it? Or the individual managers or supervisors are going to do it? What talking points are you going to give people? Are you going to choose to be political and blame the government for this? Or are you going to not politicize what you're doing and just take the hit yourself? How are you going to announce in a writing? Are you going to have a meeting? Are you going to have an email? There are a number of issues that you need to decide in terms of how you are going to communicate these changes to your workers. And the best thing you can do, other than figuring out who's impacted and how they're impacted and what you're going to do about it, is figuring out come December 1 or shortly before December 1 how you're going to communicate these changes to your workers. So best tip number 1, audit and plan. Best tip number 2, figure out your communication strategy. But best tip number 3, and maybe this is really number 1, is make sure come December 1 you have an appropriate overtime policy in place. You're going to have employees that have never been paid overtime before, that are now going to become overtime eligible, and there will be, for employees that are used to working to get the job done. I typically work 80 hours in a week because that's what it takes me to get my job done. If you have employees working 80 hours a week who are overtime eligible, they're going to put you out of business from the overtime you're going to have to pay them. You need to control how much overtime your folks are working, and the best way to do that is to put an overtime policy in place. And the policy is going to be your best friend, because the law, when you have a policy in place, the law gives you a substantial benefit of the doubt. Time worked by an employee has to be paid, whether overtime is authorized or not, if an employer knows or should know that someone is working. So you can have a policy in place, for example, that says all overtime must be authorized, and an unauthorized overtime won't be paid. Guess what? That's likely an illegal policy, because authorized or unauthorized, if somebody is working and you know or should know that that person is working, you have to pay them whether the overtime was authorized or not authorized. Your remedy in that case is to discipline and or terminate an employee who is abusing an overtime system by working without permission or without the authority of a manager or supervisor, but you have to pay the time. There is a significant exception, however, if you have policies in place in terms of reporting overtime that employees do not follow. And the policy that you need to make sure you have in place now, going forward through and continuing through and including December 1, is this overtime reporting policy. And the lead case on this issue comes right out of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appeals court that governs Ohio, White versus Baptist Memorial Hospital. In that case, you had a nurse, Margaret White, who worked through her lunches. She had charting to do, reports to run, emails to send and answer. She worked through her lunch almost daily. Unfortunately for her, her employer, the hospital, had a policy that said if you work through your meal period, through your lunch break, or otherwise work overtime, you have to report it to us in writing. And if you don't report it to us in writing, we're not going to pay the overtime. She worked through her lunch every day for years, and ultimately, when she got tired of not being paid for this time she spent working off the clock, she sued and said, look, they saw me at my desk working when I was supposed to be clocked out for lunch. They got the emails I was sending. They either did know or at a minimum should have known that I was working during my off-the-clock lunch period, and therefore I should be paid for it. And the court in White versus Baptist Memorial Hospital said no, said that the hospital's policy trumps any knowledge or constructive knowledge it had or may have had that you were working during your lunch period. The hospital put a policy in place that said that if you are working overtime off the clock, you have to report that time via time reporting system. And if you don't report that time, we're not going to pay you. And the hospital, the employer, had the right to rely on its employees to follow that policy. And if employees do not follow that policy, guess what, employees? You do not have to be paid, period. The employer doesn't have to pay you. And in case after case, courts have followed this rule all over the country, from White versus Baptist Hospital, to where now it's pretty well established that if you have an overtime reporting policy that employees don't follow, you don't have to pay them for that time they spent working. So what I recommend you do between now and December 1 is pull out your overtime or time reporting, time tracking policy, take a look at it, and make sure that you have the right policies in place to limit your exposure for overtime come December 1. Because if 4.2 million extra people are going to be impacted by these new regulations, the odds are pretty strong that you're going to have somebody come December 1 who you've never paid overtime to before, you're going to have to start paying overtime to then. And if that's the case, you want to have whatever protections and procedures in place that you can to limit your exposure to paying employees overtime. And the best protection you can get really is making sure that your policies are dusted off, polished up to date, to have the right protections in place to hedge against the risk of employees working a whole bunch of kind of unreported and unauthorized overtime. So with that, I left a few minutes for questions, and I am happy to take whatever questions we have from the assembled cyber masses.
All right, thanks, John. Just a couple reminders before we get to the questions. The questions pane is still open, so if you have any that have come about, please put your question in there for us. We will get those answered for you. This webinar is eligible for 1 general recertification credit through the HRCI. Make sure you complete the survey at the end of the webinar, and we'll email the certificate to you later this week. This webinar is recorded and will be sent to everybody who has registered for it, so you'll be getting that. So with that, our first question deals with the computer professional area. For computer professionals, 2763 times the full-time 20,000 or 2,080 hours a week is over $57,000 a year. 913 a week is hits the overtime minimum. What's the amount supposed to be? Because the hourly salary does go higher than what the other one is listed as.
Yeah, it's either or. You can either be paid a salary of $913 a week, or if you choose to compensate a computer professional on an hourly basis. Again, this is the only one of these tests that allows you to pay on an hourly basis. It is a minimum of $27.63 an hour. So you may have someone working part-time for you, for example, a computer professional. They may only work 20 hours a week, and so you may choose to pay them an hourly $27.63 and still get the benefit of the exemption. Or if you choose to put them on salary and they otherwise meet the duties test of the exemption, then the salary has to be a minimum of $913 a week. So I apologize if that wasn't clear as I was discussing the intricacies of the computer professional exemption earlier.
Yep, that makes sense. The next question we have is, we use a daily time entry system. It only logs the number of hours worked, not the in and out time. Anything we should be aware of with this approach?
Yeah, I mean, for your folks that are, well, there is no magic to how your employees record time under the Fair Labor Standards Act. In fact, you can have a system by which your employees report, we work 40 hours a week, period, and then you require them to report exceptions, for example. So today I worked 8.5 hours, tomorrow I worked whatever. You have to keep an accurate record of how long how many hours your employees are working. If you're tracking daily time, how many hours they're on the clock, how many hours they're working, that's fine. Understanding that that's going to be the proof of how many hours they're working. If an employee records 8 hours, it's 8 hours, no matter when they clocked in or clocked out. So, if you want an accurate record of how long they work, it makes sense to go to a clock in, clock out system. The same for when they're out for lunch, clock out, then clock back in. That gives you a more accurate record. But you can have any recording system you want, provided that it records how many hours an employee says they work on any given day. So if your system is, I work 8 hours today, I work 7 tomorrow, I work 9 the next day, I work 10.5 the day after, that's fine, as long as you're paying per whatever your reporting, whatever your time reporting system is.
Okay. With a lot of these laws and regulations, there are fines and penalties for not following them. Have there been any fines and penalties put into place for those who don't follow the new OT rules?
There are fines. Well, yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, there are fines and penalties. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what that dollar number is, but I know the Department of Labor is also looking at increasing them fairly significantly, so stay tuned for that. But then there's also, aside from the fines and penalties, there's also, the risk of lawsuits by employees for unpaid overtime, and that is really the that is really the biggest risk, is not so much a fine by the government, although that risk is out there, but of an employee who is improperly classified as exempt when they're really non-exempt. They don't get paid any overtime, and then they or he, she, or they, collectively a group of employees, sue you for the unpaid overtime as a result of being misclassified.
Okay, thanks. Next one is, I have an employee that makes about $60,000 a year, and that does include commission. Can I only take the 10% of their commission for that test? Their base salary is between $35,000 and $40,000. Commission is typically higher a month than their base. So is that going to be, is that 10% that's going to be included with that, or?
It depends on, well, first of all, it depends on the exemption you're looking at. If you're looking at a commissioned salesperson, right? If they're in sales, outside sales, you're looking at a different exemption that's not impacted here, and that's not going to change. If they're doing inside sales or some other role that's going to qualify them under one of the exemptions we talked about, so that the administrative exemption is likely the one that would apply, the salary has to be $913 a week, period, salary. And the commission, provided it is non-discretionary, paid pursuant to some plan, on no less frequently than quarterly, you can take 10% of that commission prorated on a weekly basis and then roll it in to see if you can get up to the $913 a week.
Okay. And one that was asking for some clarification. So as long as we have a person who's making a salary who's under the 476 per year exemption, as long as we keep them at 40 hours a week, we're okay with, there's nothing we need to make with any changes with us then, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct.
Okay. If we have two employees doing the same job, one's going to be okay and meets the new rules and the other doesn't and will need to be changed to non-exempt, are there any other issues we need to be aware of?
I'm sorry, you faded out. Can you repeat that?
Yep. We have two employees doing the exact same job. One employee will be fine meeting the new salary test. The other one won't. He'll be considered non-exempt. Is that going to create an issue with paying one salary and one at the non-exempt rate?
It won't create an issue. It doesn't create a legal issue. It might create an employee relations issue or an HR issue within the organization. If you have one person who's over, two people doing the exact same thing, and one's overtime eligible and one's not, that is going to, it has the potential to create an HR nightmare. But in terms of a legal issue, no.
All right, and then just confirming that the $913 a week for the salary, you still have to also meet the duties test, correct? Even if you're making $913 a week and don't meet the duties test, you no longer qualify as exempt, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. That does it for questions. So thank you all for staying along and enjoying our webinar. We'll be sending out the recording of this to everyone in the next week or so. So thank you once again, John, for your help. We appreciate it. And everyone have a good rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.